What if I told you that one of history's greatest military orders, masters of empires and guardians of untold treasure, was brought to its knees by a single king's ruthless decree, and that their final stand ended not on the battlefield, but on a blazing pyre by the Seine? Tonight, you'll uncover whispered secrets of forbidden rites and betrayal so profound that brothers in white turned on each other under the cold gaze of royal inquisitors. You'll learn how staggering wealth enough to bankroll armies became the very weapon used to forge false accusations of heresy. You'll glimpse into torture chambers where iron pincers and searing oil were tools of confession, and hear of a dying curse that felled both Pope and monarch in its wake. Stay with us to the very end, because hidden in the ashes of that fateful October dawn lies a secret so scandalous it has been buried for centuries, and its echoes still haunt the corridors of power today. Are you ready to step into the fire? A cold breeze swept across the narrow spit of land, carrying the distant murmur of a restless city, awakening to a grim spectacle. Flames danced hungrily around the scaffold, where a lone figure stood bound by ropes that bit into his skin. The sky, a bruised violet, bore silent witness to the final exchange between one man's steadfast will and the merciless machinery of power. In these last moments, the world seemed to hold its breath. He raised his head, eyes fixed on the gathering crowd along the river banks, faces blurred by the smoke and torchlight. Each flicker illuminated a sea of curious onlookers, some drawn by morbid fascination, others by the promise of royal justice served. Yet among them, few grasped the weight of what was about to unfold, for this was not merely the punishment of a man, but the erasure of an entire order that had once commanded respect and awe from Jerusalem to Paris. His voice, though strained, carried clearly across the night air. There was no bitterness in it, only a quiet conviction that had been forged through years of service. He spoke of loyalty, of vows sworn beneath holy banners, and of the fractures that had led to this inevitable confrontation. At times it seemed he was addressing the absent knights of his fallen brotherhood, other than the indifferent crowd, invoking memories of distant deserts and sacred pilgrimages, where steel and faith had intertwined in a noble cause. As the pyre flickered, its embers reflecting in his steady gaze, an eerie calm settled over the assembled witnesses. Even the guards, instruments of a king's decree, felt the weight of history pressing upon them. They exchanged uneasy glances, haunted by uncertainty. Had they just executed a heretic, or had they extinguished the last spark of an age-old ideal? The flames surged upward, casting grotesque shadows against the ancient stone walls that loomed nearby. Smoke curled toward the heavens, as if carrying a silent plea beyond mortal reach. In that charged silence, the boundaries between victim and victor blurred. The ritual was complete, yet its meaning had only just begun to unfold. When the final veil of smoke drifted away, the scaffold stood empty, save for a solitary, charred cross carved into the wooden unspoken testament to the man who had refused to betray his conscience. Beneath that smoldering symbol, history marked its turning point, the end of one chapter, and the unseen beginnings of countless stories yet to be told. A solitary torchbearer stepped forward, the soft scrape of his sandals on the cobblestones echoing in the hush that had descended. His lantern's glow revealed the gaunt lines etched into the condemned man's face, each wrinkle a testament to years of hardship, each scar a reminder of battles fought under foreign suns. In that lantern's trembling light, it was possible to imagine the man not as a prisoner, but as a warrior once revered, his helmet polished to a mirror sheen, his banner aloft in storm and sun alike. Moments earlier, the clatter of hooves had broken the dawn's silence as royal messengers racing through narrow streets issued their grim decree. Word of the arrest had spread like wildfire, a shock that rippled from stately chambers to humble taverns. Whispers spoke of hidden coffers and secret rites, but none could deny the force that now bore down upon the temple's grandmaster. He had been torn from his sanctuary before the first cock crowed, his brothers scattered like frightened birds as steel and oath clashed in dark cloisters. Now, as the first tongues of flame licked the wooden platform, he closed his eyes and let memories drift in. He saw olive groves, shadowed by the twilight of a foreign land, the scent of dust and spice thick in the air. He remembered young novices kneeling in silent prayer before dawn, their voices rising like incense. He recalled the clash of swords at the gates of Acre, the surge of adrenaline as steel found steel, and the unspoken promise that each of them bore to defend the weak, to serve a higher cause. A distant trumpet call punctured the reverie, summoning the guards to their posts. They formed a rigid semicircle, lances in hand, their armor glinting cruelly in the firelight. Among them stood Captain Henry, his face set in stone, yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. He had known the man, he now prepared to burn that same man whose counsel had once helped save the city from pillaging, whose knights had upheld order when fear threatened to consume the streets. And now, by royal command, he was charged with extinguishing that very honor. Across the water, ripples carried the lantern's flame to the far bank, where fishermen paused, nets slipping from tired hands. Even these humble laborers, accustomed to the ebb and flow of tides, felt the world tilt on its axis. Mothers pressed children close, and merchants shuttered their stalls, as though the execution's gravity threatened to swallow every soul within sight. In the clamoring marketplace beyond the bridge, coins lay forgotten in open purses, the promise of profit eclipsed by the spectacle unfolding in plain sight. Yet against this tableau of dread, a single voice rose soft, resolute. The condemned breathed words meant more for himself than for any onlooker. Truth endures beyond the pyre. It was neither boast nor lamentation, merely a statement of faith. Behind him, the pyre's timbers shifted, settling into place as though eager to complete their grim work. The wind gusted, snuffing one torch as if protesting the injustice, then rekindled it, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. In that charged instant, time slowed. The man's chest rose and fell deliberately, each breath a testament to unbroken will. The crowd leaned forward, drawn by a force older than fear, by the promise of witnessing history in the making. For no mere criminal stood shackled before them, but the last Grand Master of an order that had once held the keys to kingdoms and coffers alike. And as the first flames curled around his feet, the tension snapped like a drawn bowstring, unleashing a roar that would reverberate through the ages. A sudden crackle split the air as the flames curled higher, their heat painting dancing patterns on the cobblestones. The warrior's gaze remained fixed forward, unflinching, an unspoken challenge to the roaring inferno. His breath billowed in misty clouds, merging with the smoke that spiraled skyward like a silent witness to his defiance. From the crowd's edge, a young scribe scribbled furiously, his quill scratching parchment in an attempt to capture every trembling detail. He thought of the letters he would send to distant abbeys, of the ink that would stain others' pages long after these embers cooled. Yet even his practiced hand faltered, for no amount of words could fully convey the electric hush that had fallen before the pyre. Nearby, a friar crossed himself, lips moving in a silent prayer. He remembered conversing with the Grand Master years before, in a quiet chapel lit by candlelight. They had spoken of courage, of sacrifice, and of the weight of leadership. Back then, the man had spoken softly, eyes alight with conviction, as if the very stones around them recognized the gravity of their vows. Now that same voice, once a beacon of hope, was set to be silenced. A guard raised his halberd, preparing to give the signal. The crowd held its collective breath, as though the slightest murmur might shatter the moment. Then, with a curt nod from the officer in charge, the torchbearer stepped back. The flames surged forward, wrapping around the warrior's boots in a wreath of orange and gold. But the man did not cry out. Instead, he lifted his chin, shoulders squared, as if accepting an invitation sent from a realm beyond mortal reach. Each second stretched into eternity, the crackle of fire echoing like distant thunder. The heat pressed against his cloak, blotting out the intricate embroidery of crosses and fleurs de lis, symbols of an order now condemned. In that strange silence between life and oblivion, memories flooded him. He saw the faces of comrades lost to desert sands, heard the clash of steel beneath the scorching sun, felt the thrill of victory and the sting of betrayal. He recalled first kneeling before his master to take solemn vows, the chill of stone floors beneath his knees, the weight of the sword at his side promising both protection and sacrifice. Then, as if answering an unspoken prayer, a gust of wind swept along the river. It carried a distant melody, the faint tolling of church bells from a nearby abbey. Each toll reverberated through the night, a steady heartbeat defying the raging fire. The crowd stirred, the solemn call reminding them of sacred duties that transcended royal edicts. The flames recoiled momentarily, as though startled by the chime's purity. In that fleeting pause, the warrior's cloak fluttered, revealing a fragment of parchment concealed within its folds, a silent testament to truths he would not betray. The onlookers strained to see, but the thickening smoke veiled any hint of its contents. A young guard, his heart pounding, dared to glance at his captain. Captain Henry's face was unreadable, shadows dancing across his features. For an instant, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of shared regret, of duty forced upon them by orders beyond their control. The pyre crackled anew as the wind died down. The fire pressed in, its tendrils inching up the warrior's legs. Yet still, he remained still, his posture regal amidst the consuming blaze. Faces in the crowd shifted from fascination to horror as realization dawned. This was no ordinary spectacle of punishment, but a final stand of principle against forces that sought to rewrite history. With a sudden roar, a beam snapped, sending sparks cascading like a shower of stars. The man's silhouette wavered, haloed by flickering light. A child in the front row uttered a soft sob, and a murmur rippled through the spectators. Some crossed themselves again, others turned away, unable to witness what felt like the end of an era. And then, as the inferno reached its peak, the Grand Master lifted a hand, his fingers curled in a gesture both defiant and benedictory. His voice, thin but clear, rose above the crackling pyre. "Remember the oath." The words trailed off, swallowed by the roar of flames, leaving the echo of an unfinished promise. In that charged moment, time seemed to fracture. For the crowd, the execution ceased to be a final act, it became a crucible, forging a narrative that would outlive any king's decree. They watched, transfixed, as the fire claimed its due, and as the warrior's silhouette dissolved into smoke. Yet in that dissolution, a spark, a fragment of truth blazing onward, carried by memory and story to realms unseen. A hush fell as the flame's roar reached its crescendo, then gradually subsided into a low, crackling whisper. From the edges of the pyre, thin wisps of smoke curled upward, carrying with them the last tangible remnant of the man who had stood so defiantly against the inferno. Even as embers glowed red and dimmed to ash, the gravity of what had transpired lingered in the chill that settled over the riverbank. Slowly, the guards lowered their weapons and stepped back, breaking the tense tableau that had held both them and the crowd in its grip. Captain Henry signaled to the torchbearer, whose face was now half hidden by soot and candle wax, to approach once more. With careful hands, the torchbearer swept aside a scattering of burnt wood and revealed the iron spike that had anchored the man's bindings. It was still warm, an almost painful reminder of the heat that had licked at flesh and cloth alike. Nearby, the young scribe closed his journal with trembling fingers. His quill had snapped in two under the pressure of the moment, and the blot of ink marred several pages. He forced himself to look away from the lingering smoke, but the images would not release him. The resolute stance, the flicker of parchment, the echo of unfinished words. He would carry them with him, he knew, like a talisman against forgetfulness. Across the water, the fishermen had returned to their nets, but their movements were slow, as though each action required deliberation. The river itself seemed altered, its surface darker, heavier, as if it bore the memory of fire in its depths. One old man dipped a hand into the water and withdrew it quickly, as though even the river's touch felt sacred now. In the crowd, whispers rose, questions tangled with awe. Had they witnessed heresy punished, or martyrdom in its purest form? The friar who had prayed at the executions edged quietly, exchanged cloaks with a companion, and slipped into the shadows. His prayer book remained open in his hand, its pages untouched since the bells had tolled. Meanwhile, the king's envoys pushed through the gathering, collecting charred fragments of wood, in velvet pouches. These relics were destined for the royal treasury, where they would be catalogued as evidence of justice upheld. Yet among the gathered onlookers, a rumor began to spread that some secret note had burned with the Grand Master's cloak, and that its ashes contained a cipher words that, if deciphered, might unravel hidden truths. As torches were extinguished and lanterns dimmed, the ceremonial platforms were dismantled with mechanical efficiency. The guards marched off in columns, their lances held at rest, leaving behind only the faint scent of smoke and the echo of splintering beams. In the silence that followed, small groups lingered, reluctant to let go of the moment. Some touched the charred stones, as though seeking an imprint of the man's spirit. Above, the morning sky into pale grey, the first rays of dawn unveiling a city changed. Windows dripped with dew, rooftops caught the sun in soft glimmers, but the world would never be the same. The execution had carved a scar into the city's solar wound that time might heal, but never quite erase. At the water's edge, a solitary figure retrieved a shard of burnt parchment swept ashore. He tucked it into his cloak and vanished into the twisting alleys. His footsteps echoed briefly, then were swallowed by the hum of a city awakening to its own history. In the days that followed, stories of that night multiplied. Some spoke of miraculous visions. Amid the smoke, others of the Grand Master's final words carried on the wind. Minute by minute, the tale grew, each retelling adding a brushstroke to a portrait that refused to fade. And though the pyre had reduced a man to ashes, it had kindled something far more enduring, a narrative of conviction that would resonate long after the embers cooled. Thus concluded the first sweep of twilight and fire, the prelude to a saga of power, betrayal, and unyielding faith. What lay ahead would delve deeper into the forces that had set this tragedy in motion, tracing lines from lofty halls of monarchy to secret vaults of finance, from whispered confessions in cloisters to the grand stage of royal courts. But in that crucible of flame, a spark had been lit, one that no decree could extinguish and no passage of years could diminish. The first shafts of dawn found him back within the cold stone walls of the Palais de la Cite, where torches still sputtered along damp corridors. His arms, once strong pillars of command, were now drawn up behind him, wrists chafed raw by manacles that bit into flesh like obsessed wolves. The courtyard's ramparts rose stark against the pale sky, their arrow slits dark and accusing. Beyond them, the city stirred, but here, time itself seemed to have paused in cruel expectation. In a narrow cell carved from living rock, he crouched against the wall. The air was thick with the odor of stale straw and fear ascent he once knew only when waiting for battle's onslaught. Now it clung to him, inseparable from his every breath. He tilted his head back, letting the faint light from a high-slit window trace the arc of his jaw, the curve of his cheek. Each line in his face spoke of choices made, of oaths sworn beneath crescent moons and burning suns. Soon, footsteps approached, measured, relentless. A pair of gaunt jailers marshaled him into the chamber beyond, its ogival ceiling lost in shadow. There, against a broad table scarred by countless interrogations, he was unceremoniously seated. Metal clasps clicked shut around his torso, pinning him upright, as if he were a bird in a cruel dovecote. On the table lay instruments of fracture, iron pincers, coals glowing in a brazier, bottles containing oils, and ascetic solutions, all tools to reshape a man's will. They began with whispers. To clerks, quills poised, read allegations that echoed through the vaulted hall, whispered condemnations of secret rites, unspeakable provocations between knights cloaked in white. Their voices wavered, rehearsed by design, but they lacked authority until authority's instrument arrived. The chief inquisitor entered, a pale figure crowned by flickering torchlight, robes sweeping the floor in a dark tide. He paused, surveying the prisoner with the detached gaze of one accustomed to dismantling souls. Yet, when he spoke, it was less with words than with intent. At his nod, the jailers brought forth the pincers, their iron teeth cruel and precise. The first pinch snapped the silence like a crossbow bolt. Pain flared through nerves long accustomed to steel, but the warrior's face remained a mask of calm. Only a single exhalation betrayed him, a breath drawn sharp and deliberate, as though measuring the distance between agony and endurance. Hour after hour, each method unfolded. Oils were poured, warmed until they hissed against bruised flesh. Joints were wrenched in slow arcs that tested the boundaries of sinew and bone. Questions repeated until meaning dissolved into sameness. Yet with every agony, he found a still point within himself, an inner monastery where vows bound him more tightly than chains. Even as blood traced thin rivulets down his arms, he refused to utter the words they sought. The flick of a quill on parchment sounded hollow compared to the vow he had taken before heaven. But torture is a conversation that yields its secrets only to persistence. When the night was deepest and corridors emptied of torches, a new voice crept into his consciousness, a memory of fresh air under a sapphire sky, of brotherhood around shared meal and prayer. That memory stung with longing, but also steeled him. If they broke his body, his spirit would remain an unbroken blade. At the first hint of dawn, the Inquisitor returned. His parchment was filled with accusations drawn from the screams of those broken before him, but it awaited the seal of confession. He leaned close, voice low and clinical. "Swear what we demand, avow the charges, and your suffering ends." The brazier's glow painted his face in hellish hues, flickering across a scar, as though it bore witness to crimes older than justice itself. The prisoner's reply came slowly, each word a stone placed upon a foundation of unyielding faith. "My conscience is not your ledger." In that bleak chamber, the last Grand Master of the Temple claimed command of his own narrative, defying both rhetoric and iron. And though he knew the hours ahead would push him beyond the brink, he understood that true honor demands sacrifice at the moment it seems least possible. They returned him to the cell, shoulders slumped, but eyes still alight within a flame. Word of his resistance rippled through the shadowed hall's. Courtiers shivered at the tale of a man who withstood unspeakable torment without betrayal. Rumor whispered that the king himself trembled at such resolve, for it undermined the very premise of his power. Yet for the condemned, power had long since shifted away from crowns and courts into the quiet dominion of unbroken will. And so the procession of suffering continued, day after day, each dawn bringing fresh instruments, fresh inquiries, fresh hopes that maybe, at this next threshold of sensation, his resolve might break. But each time he emerged from that crucible, he carried with him a testament that would one day transcend the walls of prison and the flames of the pyre. That faith, once forged in honor, cannot be undone by force. In the hushed corridors, even the sound of his footsteps became a testament, echoes of resistance that would keep his story alive in the hearts of those who dared to remember. Beyond the damp walls of his cell, the world had long forgotten how the temple once rose from humble chaplaincies into a power that rivaled kings. In the hush of pre-dawn, where even the city's merchants had yet to pry open their shutters, the order's scholars pored over ledgers thicker than any holy tome. Silver and gold flowed through their vaulted chambers in rivers as steady as those that sustained the vineyards of Provence. Knights in white mantles guarded treasures that spanned continents, silken carpets from the bazaars of Cairo, ingots minted in the workshops of Aquitaine, and precious relics offered by grateful monarchs in exchange for safe passage through perilous lands. Reputation, however, was the order's true currency. Pilgrims spoke in hushed awe of the brothers who escorted them through bandit-haunted roads and across scorching deserts. Word of their discipline, their charity, and their martial prowess spread like wildfire through Mediterranean ports. Soon, spurred by both devotion and pragmatism, even the wealthiest nobles entrusted their savings to the Grand Master's vaults, knowing that far from the intrigues of royal courts, the temple's fortress-like banks offered unmatched security. A simple parchment note, a letter of credit, could be cashed in Acre or Chartres, sparing merchants from lugging heavy coin across hostile terrain. Yet the melding of sword and coin carried its own perils. As portfolios swelled and estates multiplied, the once humble warriors found themselves negotiating treaties rather than battling Saracen armies. Beneath vaulted ceilings carved with scenes of crusader valor, statutes were drafted to regulate interest and collateral, giving life to one of Europe's earliest financial systems. Seneschals oversaw revenue from vineyards in Champagne and olive groves in Sicily. A network of agents, cloaked in white, ensured that each transaction upheld the order's vow of honesty, though whispered rumors hinted that some accounts bore secrets darker than any heresy. Within these burgeoning halls of commerce, young knights learned the art of diplomacy as keenly as they had learned the art of war. In Paris, representatives brokered loans to queens and dukes. In Valencia, they mediated disputes between merchants and Visigothic barons. Every exchange strengthened the order's position, weaving its influence into the very fabric of European politics. Yet with every pouch of coin filled, the Grand Master sensed the fragile tension between spiritual mission and worldly power, a tension that would one day be wielded against him, sharpened blade. As dawn broke, the tortured Grand Master pressed his back against the cold stone, recalling how those same halls of finance once rang with laughter and debate. He remembered charting the course of caravans under a starlit sky, guiding laden camels through mountain passes, and sharing simple bread with peasants whose prayers had kindled the order's humble beginnings. In that memory lay the pure spark that had ignited every venture, not the promise of wealth, but the promise of service, of sanctuary, and of hope. Now, shackled and bleeding, he saw how the very wealth he had overseen could be reframed as proof of heresy. Already, in the marble corridors of the Louvre, royal scribes twisted ledgers into confessions, secret indulgences, forbidden rites, unsanctioned pledges to foreign powers. Silver chalices, once used to feed the poor, were recast as evidence of hidden rituals. Letters of credit became missives plotting rebellion. The same instruments that had ensured safe passage for pilgrims now served as dagger points twisting in his legacy. The memory shifted to a grand hall, where tapestries depicted holy crusades alongside scenes of thriving marketplaces. There, nobles in ermine cloaks hailed the Grand Master as both spiritual guide and financier extraordinaire. Their toasts had mingled wine with admiration, blessing his name for preserving Christendom's pilgrims and its coffers alike. Yet in those very echoes of praise, he now heard the whisper of treachery, that power and piety cannot coexist without courting envy. The stronger the order's financial roots, the more tempting its fruit for a crown desperate to fill its own coffers. And so, in the stillness before another session of torment, he vowed that this story, like the stories of the caravans, the banks, and the battles, would survive. For even if ledgers burned and vaults lay empty, the truth of why an order of simple brothers had taken up swords would endure, through every chapter of cruelty and conspiracy yet to unfold. That central truth, service above self, would light the way, a beacon no flame could utterly extinguish. He was born beneath the slate roofs of a Burgundian manor, where every dawn found church bells heralding the rhythm of prayer and harvest. As a boy, he learned to ride before he could read, balancing atop a dappled mare across dew-dampened fields. His mornings began with lessons in Latin and scripture, his afternoons with the clang of wooden swords echoing against the barn's stone walls. Even then, the weight of destiny pressed upon his young shoulders. He was the second son of a minor house, destined neither for the ducal court nor a grand inheritance. In those early years, the world he knew balanced precariously between duty and ambition. His first taste of real steel came at 12, when he was sent to train under a knight whose banners bore the fleur-de-lis of France. The knight was a stern man whose laughter was as rare as summer rain, but who taught him that true valor was tested not in tournament lists, but in the steadiness of one's heart when faced with choice. He learned to hold a lance, so that his forearm ached with purpose, to wear armor, so that each clasp reminded him of vows yet to be taken. Yet even as he mastered martial exercises, a quieter pursuit shaped him just as deeply. In the library's flickering candlelight, he immersed himself in tales of pilgrim roads, of distant Jerusalem, of brothers who sacrificed all for the shelter of the faithful. Those illuminated manuscripts revealed a world beyond Burgundy's rolling hills, of desert caravans and holy wars, of ruins haunted by history, and of places where every sunrise burned with promise and peril alike. At 16, he made his choice. In a chapel scented with incense and echoing with the chant of monks, he knelt before a simple wooden cross. Silver armor and a handsome dowry had once seemed the rewards of his lineage, but he renounced them both. His hair was cut short, his cloak exchanged for the stark white mantle of the temple. When he rose, the candle flames reflected in his eyes, steady as the stars under which he would soon ride. His early years as a brother were defined by hardship as much as by ceremony. He traded Burgundian banquets for pilgrim rations, his childhood gambols, replaced by watchful nights atop crumbling walls. His first journey to the Levant carried him across sting-hot sands, through mountain passes slick with rain, and into the shadow of Acre's battered gates. There, he learned that faith without action was an empty vessel. When a band of highwaymen ambushed a convoy of peasants, it was not his blade, but his command of brothers that turned the tide. Word of his composure under fire reached the Grandmaster himself. He saw in the young knight a blend of steel and empathy, a rare combination amid an order torn between warrior pride and charitable mission. Invitations followed, councils in stone halls where strategies were weighed, debates in candlelit chambers over how best to balance swords with sustenance. Each gathering honed his mind as sharply as any blade. By his mid-20s, he had risen through the ranks, first as marshal, organizing squadrons with the precision of a seasoned tactician, then as preceptor, overseeing provinces from Cyprus to Provence. He moved among courts nonetheless, negotiating safe passage for legions of pilgrims, forging alliances that extended the temple's reach without betraying its vows. In Paris, he sat at the king's table. In Rome, he knelt before the Pope's throne. Yet he remained ever a brother among brothers, sharing in their prayers before every campaign, and their sorrows when losses came. Through these years, two qualities set him apart: an unwavering sense of justice and an almost preternatural calm. When a dispute erupted among knights over spoils captured in battle, he settled it with a fairness that earned respect even from the most proud. When famine struck a neighboring settlement, he diverted funds from the order's coffers without hesitation, trusting that true strength lay in service. His mantle came to symbolize more than authority. It stood for integrity and a world all too willing to bend principle to profit. So it was that, when the seat of Grandmaster became vacant, the chapters convened beneath vaulted ceilings in the temple's Parisian commandery. Representatives journeyed from every province, scarred veterans, austere prelates, humbled administrators, each bearing witness to his reputation. In the hush that fell before the vote, candles guttered as if sensing the gravity of their choice. Then came his election, carried by acclamation other than protocol, for his record had spoken louder than any speech. Assuming the mantle of Grandmaster transformed his world once more. He inherited not only the keys to vast treasuries and the command of thousands of brothers, but the burden of guiding an order at a crossroads. The fall of Acre had dimmed the Crusader dream. European monarchs eyed the temple's wealth with covetous hearts, and yet, beneath the trappings of power, he carried with him the memory of that Burgundian boy who had first knelt before a cross-vowing service, embracing sacrifice and believing that honor could endure through any trial. In those moments before his arrest, he stood at the pinnacle of his order's history, warrior, diplomat, steward of faith and finance. He wore his lineage not on a shield, but in the resolve that would soon be tested beyond measure. The journey from Burgundian fields to the helm of the temple had shaped him into a leader, as brilliant in counsel as he was in combat, and it was this fusion of qualities that sparked both admiration and envy, lighting the tinder of conspiracy that would soon engulf him. The memory of Acre's fall haunted him like a spectre that refused to be laid to rest. He could still feel the sting of salt spray on his skin as he stood atop the crumbling walls, peering down at the tangled mass of starving defenders and fleeing civilians. Siege engines had thundered each dawn, hurling stones at cracked masonry like brittle bones. Flames had leapt along ramparts, turning corridors into ovens where smoke and despair intertwined. When the final breach came, it was not with the fanfare of triumph, but with the hollow clatter of surrender. Men slumped at one another's throats, exhausted beyond fury. He had ordered the retreat that saved a remnant of his brethren. Yet in those final hours, he learned that valor alone could not hold a city against the tides of geopolitical will. Back in Paris, he convened a council that stretched from candlelit strictures of the chapter house to the whispered thresholds of royal antechambers. Eyes tired from loss turned to him for direction. If the temple was to survive, it needed more than martial valor, it needed renewal. He spoke of forging alliances not only with princes, but with the rising merchant republics, whose fleets might defend Mediterranean passages as effectively as any sword. He proposed reforms to knit the scattered commanderies into a tighter federation, standardized training, shared intelligence on enemy movements, and a common treasury oversight that could respond in hours, not seasons. Each proposal drew nods from preceptors, but wary frowns from seasoned knights accustomed to autonomy. Yet it was his vision for a council of the Cedars, a permanent assembly of regional masters, empowered to advise and, if necessary, to constrain the Grand Master, that sparked the fiercest debate. To some, it felt like inviting fragmentation; to others, the only bulwark against the very overreach that had made the order both indispensable and powerless. When he reminded them that pride had cost them acre, that pride had allowed a single king's envy to cascade into papal condemnation, the whole fell silent. Slowly, grudging consensus formed. The temple would become more flexible, its branches less beholden to local fiefdoms and more to a shared charter of integrity. In that compromise, he saw the promise of rebirth, but news arrived in swift dispatches that tested even his tempered resolve. King Philip IV, flush with contempt for clerical privilege and desperate to fill royal coffers after costly wars, began courting whispers of brimstone and heresy. Preachers in provincial villages spoke of dark oaths under consecrated banners. Courtiers in Paris murmured of secret midnight masses in hidden chapels. The Grand Master recognized the pattern: first discredit, then dispossess, then destroy. He redoubled efforts to prove the order's transparency, inviting royal auditors to inspect granaries in Cyprus, commissioning papal envoys to review temple records in Aquitaine, even opening cloister vaults to curious notaries. Yet every gesture of cooperation was twisted into a hallmark of guilt. Every candlestick offered to light the truth only cast deeper shadows. Amid these maneuvers, he still found moments to walk the quiet ambulatory of the Paris commandery, the arches humming with the echo of chanting novices. He would pause before the chapter's grand map, a sprawling cartograph of crusade estates, caravan routes, and fortified enclaves, and trace the lines where victories had once been carved. He ran a finger along the ribbon of road leading to Tyre, where the temple's vaults had first amassed coin, from merchants to wary to carry gold across hostile terrain. That same route was now a lifeline for peasants fleeing famine. He vowed that no decree, however cunning, would sever the order's bond to the poor and pilgrim. In those corridors of memory and strategy, he shaped a fragile bulwark against the storm gathering beyond stone walls. He reminded his brothers that the order had been born of necessity, of shelter in a world fractured by faith and avarice, and that its mission transcended battlements and banquets alike. Each night, he prayed not merely for strength, but for clarity, that when the tempest broke, they would stand together not as vassals proffered to a crown's whim, but as brothers united by vows deeper than any royal seal. Unbeknownst to him, the storm was already upon them, and the first lightning bolt would strike in a king's gilded council chamber, its thunder to echo through history's darkest corridors. A sliver of dawn light filtered through the high windows of the Louvre's council chamber, illuminating tapestries woven with scenes of royal triumph. At the long oak table, King Philip IV sat beneath a carved stone canopy, his brow furrowed as he traced the lines of a ledger thicker than any treaty. Across from him, his treasurer, gaunt man, whose hands trembled with the weight of unpaid debts, laid out the figures in grim detail. Loans from Flemish bankers that had financed recent wars, interest accrued on Neapolitan gold that never arrived, and the staggering sums still owed to Genoese merchants. Each number seemed to seep into the very air, turning the chamber's carved marble floor cold beneath Philip's boots. He had never been a man to shrink from hardship. whose rise to the throne had demanded both shrewd strategy and ruthless will. But the coffers were bone dry, and the demands of crown and court showed no mercy. Hidden behind glazed portraits of ancestors who had led France to grandeur, he sensed the murmurs of discontent growing louder beyond the palace gates. Tax revolts flared in Provence, and mercenary captains clamoured for pay. The realm teetered on the brink of chaos unless he found a way to replenish his treasury. His gaze shifted to a sealed dispatch bearing the temple's red wax seal. It contained the latest account of revenues collected across the order's commanderies, tithes from vineyards, tariffs on pilgrim caravans, and profits from estates that stretched from the Rhineland to Sicily. Rumours had long circulated of the temple's hidden vaults of coffers so immense that even kings borrowed against them. Philip sniffed, recalling how a decade earlier the Grand Master's envoy had politely declined a request for a loan to fund a Flemish campaign, citing the order's sacred mission. At the time, the refusal had seemed merely prudent. Now it felt like a personal affront. He turned to his advisors, cardinals in crimson robes, dukes in brocade doublets, each more eager than the next to see the temple stripped of both power and resources. They spoke of precedent, how past monarchs had marshalled heresy charges to confiscate church lands and swell royal treasuries. They reminded him of Simon de Montfort and the Albigensians, of how papal bulls had cleared the way for seizures unhindered by secular restraint. Their voices rose in harmony, painting the Grand Master as a foreign potentate, a warlord in white, whose allegiances lay beyond France's borders. Philip listened, savouring each suggestion. He envisioned a campaign of rhetoric and spectacle, mass arrests at dawn, publicised confessions penned under duress, and a grand procession hauling looted treasures to Paris. He imagined the temple's proud banners falling before his triumphal arch, their white crosses defiled by royal decree. Such a display would not only replenish his coffers, but also send an unambiguous message that in France, the crown's authority was absolute, even over the holiest knights. He raised a hand, silencing the chorus of ambition. "Prepare the writ," he commanded, voice low but resonant. "Let the summons issue on a Friday, the 13th of next month. No mercy for hesitation. We strike swiftly, so that awe and fear march in step." A murmur of assent rippled through the chamber. The king's eyes, gleaming with resolve, turned back to the ledger. The moment of reckoning was at hand, not merely for a man bound to a pyre, but for an entire order that had become both a threat and a temptation. As quills scratched across parchment in hurried agreement, the first bolt of Philip's storm was loosed into motion. Beyond the palace walls, Paris still slumbered, unaware that its fate and the fate of its greatest champions would soon be reshaped by royal ambition. A crisp October dawn broke over Paris. Its chill breeze, carrying more than the promise of autumn, it bore the weight of a king's design. As church bells tolled the first hour, royal heralds mounted on black chargers thundered through silent streets, their trumpets summoning the city's white-mantled knights to heed a summons from the crown. Each commandery, from the narrow lanes by Notre Dame to the courtyards near the Seine's western bend, stood at attention, unsuspecting of the betrayal about to unfold. Within the temple's famed courtyard, novices assembled for morning prayers, chanting psalms beneath columns carved with crusader motifs. The Grand Master, still gaunt from his ordeals, arrived to oversee the ritual. His bearing was calm, even attentive. He noted which brethren had returned from the sick wards, which squires practiced in the yard, and which captains were away on diplomatic errands. When his procession paused to bless a pillar adorned with the order's crest, none could have guessed that within the hour, every bond of trust would be severed by royal decree. At an appointed signal, a discreet drop of a herald's banner guards, loyal to King Philip, spilled through hidden passages, their steel cloaks gleaming with dawn's pale light. Simultaneously, in every city where the temple held sway, the same maneuver unfolded. Convents surrounded, gates barred, banners torn down. The knights, still clad in ceremonial white, found themselves hemmed in by powerful serried ranks of crossbowmen and halberdiers, each bearing the royal fleur-de-lis. The Grand Master felt the first tremor of realization as armored pursuivants approached him, Their captain read aloud the royal writ, charges of idolatry, obscene rites, illicit wealth, and treason against the crown. His voice echoed hollowly against the carved walls, as though the echo itself recoiled from the enormity of the act. He gently laid a hand on the nearest squire's shoulder, a silent plea for calm before, bidding his brothers kneel and submit peacefully. Pandemonium rippled through the compound. Some knights, hearts pounding with outrage, drew their swords only to be met by crossbow bolts severed mid-gesture. Others, still loyal to the oaths they had sworn, knelt and unclasped their mantles, their white crosses stained already by the dust of royal boots. In the shadowed cloisters, the sound of shackles clinking mingled with whispered prayers. A young page, tears streaking his soot-dark face, pressed a scrap of parchment into the Grand Master's handwords penned in secret that spoke of forged testimonies and coerced witnesses. Their truth would remain locked in a dying whisper. Outside, Paris began to stir. Merchants opened shutters to find knights in bonds, their proud banners draped over blockaded doors. Working stonemasons paused in their carving, marveling at how swiftly the city's defenders had become captives. Citizens pressed against barricades, torn between relief that the elusive riches might enrich the crown, and dread that a sacred brotherhood had been so ruthlessly dismantled. Elsewhere, in Lyon and Bordeaux, in Valencia and Rhodes, the same drama was replayed with brutal precision. Couriers bearing the king's orders had long since arrived. Townsfolk woke to the sight of white mantles strewn by gallows, the greatest scandal of the age unfurling in every market square. Rumors raced that ships bound for Acre had been intercepted, their hold ransacked for censers and chalices, now counted among the evidence of sacrilege. Back at the parish chapter house, the Grand Master stood alone before a stone altar, his wrists bound, but his spirit unbroken. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, recalling how his brothers had once knelt beside him for blessings before battle. Now, they knelt to the will of a king who saw them as rivals rather than allies. Yet, even in the clutch of betrayal, his resolve crystallized. Though the order's walls might crumble and its vaults be emptied, the ideals for which they had lived and for which he still bore the mantle would find new vessels in hearts unbound. As the evening bells tolled another day's end, the courtyard lay empty, but for the echoes of footsteps long gone. Above, the fading light painted the temple spires in mournful gold. The first chapter of Philip's campaign had closed, and with it, the illusion of security that had guarded the knights for 2 centuries. What remained was a reckoning of wills, a struggle not merely for treasure or titles, but for the very soul of an order forged in conviction and consecrated by sacrifice. The dawn after the arrests brought a grim procession through narrow streets slick with dew and dread. Bound in iron and hooded to veil his face, he rode atop a low wagon flanked by silent guards whose boots struck sparks from the cobbles. Behind him followed rows of brothers in white mantles, their arms shackled, eyes downcast, forced into submission by the weight of royal power. The air, crisp and fragrant with autumn's decay, carried a tension that set merchants' hearts racing and mothers' children clutched closer. They halted at the great square before the royal palace, where a scaffold of polished oak awaited, draped in crimson tapestries to lend solemnity to the spectacle. At its foot, makeshift benches held assembled notables, prelates in their finery, senators of the parliament, ambassadors from foreign courts, everyone summoned to witness the judgment of an order once untouchable. Above them, banners bearing the fleur-de-lis snapped in the breeze, a visual reminder that the crown now claimed dominion even over the sacred white cross. When he emerged from the wagon, the hood was removed. His hair, long and unkempt from weeks in darkness, framed a face that had endured both flame and iron. He stood straight, shoulders squared beneath the tattered remnants of his mantle, as though still clad in the dignity of his office. Murmurs rippled through the crowd at the sight of him. Some whispered that even in ruin, he carried himself like a ruler. Others sniffed that robes soiled by prison could conceal unspeakable guilt. A herald stepped forward, voice echoing off the palace walls. "Jacques de Molay, late Grand Master of the Knights Templar, you stand accused of heresy, idolatry, and levying war against the crown. How say you to these charges? The question hung in the chill air like a charge of its own. For a moment, no answer came, but the creak of wood as he shifted his weight. Then his voice, calm and clear, rose above the hush. I have served my vows with honor. I stand before God, not man, answerable for my deeds. The herald riposted with a curt, "Let the court convene." To high-ranking officials, one a cardinal draped in scarlet, the other a royal justice in ermine ascended the scaffold steps. They read from parchment scrolls, reciting alleged testimonies extracted under canonical methods in Provence, Aquitaine, and the Lead of France. The charges were lurid: worship of a bearded idol, secret kisses exchanged in shadowed chapels, rituals dedicated to a demonic power. As each accusation fell, he closed his eyes briefly, as if shielding himself from falsehood. When the first witnesses were called, they came shackled and gaunt former brethren who, broken under torture, had testified against him and each other. Their voices trembled as they described candle-lit assemblies where knights had renounced Christ and uttered blasphemies. Yet even their confessions betrayed uncertainty. I do not recall. They forced me. My memory falters, punctuated an otherwise damning script. Each time, he met their gaze with compassion rather than indignation, as though pained for souls enslaved even as their words threatened to enslave him. The crowd watched, rapt. Some feigned revulsion, others stared, captivated by the drama of betrayal and perceived depravity. Noble women curtained their faces, ragged beggars leaned forward on the walls. Even the birds seemed silent, as if startled by the scale of what unfolded in open air. Toward midday, the cardinal pounded his staff on the dais. Your silence speaks volumes, he declared. By virtue of these confessions, we demand that you abjure your heresy and confess your guilt, so that mercy may temper justice. He gestured to a table bearing a crucifix and a knife-shaped pen. Sign here, renounce your errors, and you shall be spared the stake. A hush fell. The pageantry of the law robes, scrolls, trumpets pressed upon him, and the weight of all Christendom's eyes. Yet he straightened, tilting his chin upward. My soul is bound only to truth, he said. No stroke of pen can undo a lie. I will not betray my brothers, nor profane the vows I took before God. His refusal landed like a guillotine's blade, severing hope of clemency. Murmurs turned to gasps. The cardinal's face flushed. The royal justice stepped forward, expression grim. Then you choose your sentence, he intoned. We condemn you to be degraded, stripped of your honors, and to suffer capital punishment, as fit for an unrepentant heretic. On cue, two executioners, faces hidden beneath cowls, advanced. One unfurled a crimson robe, emblematic of the cardinal's mercy, but not for him. The other clasped heavy shackles that would bind him to the pyre. The brothers watched, some wincing, others weeping silently. He glanced at them, lips moving in what seemed like a final benediction. As the executioners led him away, the crowd parted like a sea, revealing a long procession toward the riverbank where the scaffold had been prepared long ago. Beneath his feet, the wooden planks rang hollow, as though mourning the footsteps of a man they once bore in triumph. The cardinal followed, chanting a Latin litany, while the royal justice observed in stony silence. At the water's edge, the pyre stood ready against the dying light. Flames flickered within its structure, leaping in anticipation. He paused for a moment, breathing the cool air, feeling the earth beneath his anklets. Then, with measured steps, he climbed the scaffold, each rung a testament to choices made and truths upheld. He removed his shorn cloak to reveal the white mantle, its cross now singed at the edges, and laid it on the platform as an offering. The executioner thrust him forward, and the shackles locked around his ankles. He knelt, murmured a whispered prayer in the ancient tongue of the temple, and closed his eyes. Around him, torches sprang to life, and the crowd drew back, forming a silent amphitheater of dread and awe. The wind carried the scent of river and wood smoke, mingling into a heady perfume of ending and beginning. Then, as if on cue, the executioner struck a flint, and sparks set the pyre alight. Flames surged upward, swallowing cloak and mantle alike. The heat rinsed the air with crackles and roars, pressing at eardrums and lungs. For countless witnesses, time fractured, some seeing only the inferno, others catching the arch of his bowed head, the quiet dignity of his kneeling form. Minutes later, the fire consumed itself, leaving charred remains and drifting embers that sailed into the night sky like restless spirits. A hush enveloped the square. The cardinal lowered his eyes, the royal justice bit his lip. Even the crowd, galvanized by a spectacle, stood unmoving as if all had become an equal measure of fear. In the hush, a lone voice rose, a novice's chant, wavering yet resolute. Deus meus et omnia, God is my all. It echoed across the silent square, a final offering of faith. And though the pyre had reduced his body to ash, the strength of that battered, unbroken will cast a shadow longer than history's darkest night. It was the end of one chapter, but the first breath of legend. Dawn's pale light found the city still shrouded in the afterglow of embers, drifting skyward like wounded birds. Paris began to stir anew, yet beneath its cobbled streets and tiled rooftops, a deeper tremor took hold, a whisper that power exacts its price, and that even kings and popes are mortal at the mercy of unseen forces. In Avignon, the newly enthroned Pope Clement V awoke with a start. Only months had passed since he had presided over the ceremonies condemning the temple, and already the burden of his decision weighed heavily upon him. The corridors of his papal palace, usually alive with chanting clerics and rustling silk, now echoed emptily. Couriers brought news that unsettled even the most devout. Reports of his own nobles falling ill under mysterious fevers, of benefices once guaranteed by papal favor, now lying vacant as prelates succumbed in droves. His personal physician, summoned in haste, shook his head over trembling charts. No ailment matched these symptoms, only a creeping lethargy and fevered visions of flames and crosses. Half a world away, King Philip IV felt a similar chill in his bones. Fresh from his triumph over the Templars, he had anticipated the swell of applause, the weight of crowns in grateful hands. Instead, envoys from Burgundy and Flanders delivered word of frost-killed vineyards and a plague of crippling arthritis among his household guard. Horses lame in their stalls, grain stores festering with blight, each misfortune chipped away at his assurance of divine favor. In the candlelit council chamber, he watched his treasurer pale as parchment after parchment detailed losses that no tax increase could remedy without risking revolt. Both men tried to dismiss such portents as coincidence or divine testing, but rumor carried a life of its own. In taverns along the Seine, fishermen spoke of a shadow rising from the pyre's ashes, a curse uttered in the final breath of a man who refused to betray his faith. In cloistered chapters far from Paris, monks whispered of voices heard on autumn wines, lamenting "Remember the oath," as though Jacques de Molay's dying invocation had become an incantation bounding across heaven and earth. By the time Clement's fever spiked and Philip's joint stiffened beyond relief, that whisper had grown into a roar. Cardinals who once endorsed the papal decision or watched their patron's health with trembling lips, fearing that divine justice had turned its gaze from heretics to their own shepherd. At Philip's court, nobles exchanged uneasy glances had their king, who claimed absolute authority, drawn down a wrath deeper than any papal interdict. Within the walled gardens of the Vatican estate, Clement lay surrounded by incense-laden air, flat on a bed of polished oak. His hands prayed ceaselessly, fingers clutched in poignant urgency. Outside his chamber, clerics convened to prepare rites of absolution, wondering whether these final sacraments would spare his soul or deliver it to an uncharted judgment. Yet no prayer could still the tremor in his frame. On the seventh day of his fevered stupor, as candle flames guttered low in the incense-choked chapel, he whispered into the darkness, "May mercy find me as I once showed mercy." Then his chest stilled, and history recorded the passing of the man who had condemned the Templars. In Paris, Philip, too, awoke one morning unable to rise from his bed. His limbs, once instruments of command and conquest, lay unresponsive. He demanded remedies, herbal infusions, bathhouses filled with spring waters, prayers whispered by the deepest mystics his realm could summon, but none offered reprieve. As weeks passed, the great king grew gaunt, his once commanding voice reduced to a raspy whisper that trembled with newfound humility. On a cold December dawn, large enough for courtiers to stand shivering against torches in the courtyard, Philip IV breathed his last, his final decree unuttered. The near-simultaneous deaths of Pope and King stunned Europe. Without a clear successor on the throne, and with the papal seat vacant, the continent lurched into a void of power. Ambassadors scurried to claim privileges once guaranteed by royal or papal authority. Rebel claimants sharpened their ambitions in silent courtrooms. Meanwhile, the Templars, officially extinguished but mythically resurrected in rumor, found their legacy reborn in the vacuum. Tales of secret vaults untouched by crown or church spread across merchant lanes. Whispers of surviving brethren hiding in plain sight filled remote monasteries. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy was the sense that Jacques de Molay's final invocation, his solemn demand that his truth be remembered, had transcended his execution. Kings and popes had wielded their might, yet both fell victim to forces beyond their control. The story of the Templars, once a tale of martial and financial might, transformed into a legend of conviction that outlived every crown and cross. And in the hearts of those who heard the tale, the memory of a defiant man, consumed by fire yet unbroken in spirit, became a beacon of defiance against tyranny, proof that even in the darkest chapter, a single spark of unwavering faith can ignite the embers of change. As news of their untimely deaths rippled across Christendom, a strange stillness settled over the lands once bound by royal decree and papal bull. Without a throne to uphold the king's will or a tiara to sanctify the pope's mandates, Europe found itself suspended between orders, as if holding its breath for the next hand to play. In the old temple courts, now silent but for the susurrus of wind through empty cloisters, pilgrims paused at the charred stones, bowing their heads not in fear, but in awe of how swiftly power itself could crumble. Stories began to weave themselves into every corner of the continent. In the marketplaces of Venice, merchants whispered of a hidden convoy of Templar gold spirited away under cover of dawn in Irish abbeys. Monks penned ballads recalling a Grand Master who had faced both fire and iron without yielding his conscience. Even the itinerant troubadours found fresh verses, singing of crosses blackened by smoke and the echo of a vow that outlived its keeper's final breath. Yet these tales, rich as they were, touched only the surface of what had truly transpired. For beneath the sheen of legend lay a deeper lesson, that allegiance to truth and to one's own principles can ripple outward far beyond the confines of any cell or scaffold. The Grand Master's refusal to recant, the King's ambition undone by forces beyond his reach, and the Pope's final prayer for mercy all converged into a single thread that ran like a red line through the tapestry of medieval history. Over the years, a stone rebuilt what flame had raised, and as new pontiffs and monarchs assumed their thrones, the memory of those October days endured. Scholars debated in candlelit libraries whether the Templars had truly fallen victim to slander, or whether their wealth and influence had simply outgrown the world that had birthed them. Artists painted their final moment in hues both somber and sublime, and in every recounting, the same refrain emerged, that the greatest power a man or an order can wield is the power to stand immutable in the face of obliteration. In the centuries that followed, emblems of the White Cross resurfaced in distant lands, carried by exiled brothers or adopted by secret societies who claimed lineage to that vanished legacy. The exact truth of what occurred beneath Paris' grey skies and on the banks of the Seine blurred beneath layers of myth. Yet through every iteration, whether in whispered conspiracy or scholarly treatise, the core remained unchanged. Jacques de Molay's final words, uttered as flame curled around him, had kindled an enduring light. And so, as the Middle Ages gave way to new eras of exploration and enlightenment, the story passed from chroniclers to poets, from parable to pilgrimage. It became less a record of accusation and punishment, and more a testament to the resilience of conviction. The order that had once defied sultans and safeguarded pilgrims had been undone by a king's greed, yet in that very undoing, it was reborn as a symbol, a living reminder that ideals, once etched into the hearts of men, survive longer than empires. Now, standing on the threshold of modernity, we look back at those days of torchlight and tribunal simply to mourn a bygone tragedy, but to draw from it a lesson as urgent today as it was 700 years ago. That true legacy lies not in the gold we amass or the crowns we wear, but in the truths we hold and the vows we keep, even when all the world conspires to silence them. In that quiet defiance, the final ember still glows, an invitation for each of us to carry its light into our own age. And so the curtain falls on a tale woven of fire and faith, power and principle. Though centuries have passed since the ash settled along the Seine, the echo of a solitary voice steadfast in its final invocation continues to resonate through every act of conscience and every stand against oppression. In remembering Jacques de Molay, we keep alive a spark that no throne can extinguish and no tribunal erase, the enduring capacity of a single, unwavering soul to illuminate even the darkest of ages.